This remarkable similarity of Russia's attack on Ukraine and how the Soviet Union in 1939 attacked Finland. Even then, the Soviet Union expected that attack to be a very easy one and like the war to be over within 2 weeks.
NATO hasn't historically had an Arctic strategy, and Russia has been able to build a preponderance of power in the Arctic, and that is a direct threat to NATO's security of supply lines in North Atlantic in a crisis or a conflict between Russia and NATO or some NATO countries.
It was so emotional when Finland became member of NATO, precisely for this reason. This was something that people repeated all the time, never again alone. Like, now we're finally part of something bigger.
Societal trust plays a key part in the Finnish model, and to build trust between citizens, political parties, among companies that might be competing in other contexts, and between companies and the government. That takes a lot of time. You need to make a very conscious effort to make sure that every part of the society understand why there is a need to cooperate when it comes to certain national security issues.
Welcome back to The Ties That Bind, NATO Allies in Action. I'm Natalia Kapitnik, the Communications Director at the Foreign Policy Research Institute, and this season on The Ties That Bind, we are taking a deeper look at how individual member countries on the front line contribute and collaborate within the alliance. This week, we go even further north, to Finland, one of the alliance's newest members. Like the other frontline states we visited this season, Finland shares a turbulent and complicated history with Russia that has long molded its security and foreign policy. But unlike the other frontline states, it was actually not a member of NATO at the start of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. February 24, 2022 proved to be a lynchpin moment for how Finnish society viewed its security and its future. In this episode, we'll hear from two Finnish experts about that moment in time, both culturally and politically, about the process and challenges of Finland's NATO accession, and the country's strategic role in the Arctic and what it means for the alliance in the future. We'll also hear about Finland's whole-of-society defense model and how the country's culture has informed its security calculus and what other allies can learn from the Finnish experience. And we'll also discuss lessons from Finland's history for Ukraine. Thanks for joining us. Finland formally joined NATO on April 4, 2023, a little less than a year after its formal application. To learn about what this process entailed, I spoke with Joel Linnanmäki, a research fellow at the Finnish Institute of International Affairs and a formal special advisor to Pekka Haavisto, the foreign minister who oversaw the country's accession process. What was it like to witness Finland's change of its decades-long policy on both Russia and NATO? So maybe walk us through the time, how you saw that from a personal perspective and how you saw that process play out kind of in your role.
Yeah, I'll just start by noting the first 6 months of our government term in 2019, so way before our NATO membership process and the full-scale invasion by Russia of Ukraine, we had the EU presidency. Then we had a change of prime ministers from Antti Rinne to Sanna Marin, whom some of your listeners might have heard of, who just wrote a book about her term as the youngest prime minister of Finland in Finland's history. And then we had COVID. So I often felt that the times were a bit too historic already before the full-scale invasion and our accession process. But of course, things intensified in a major way in February of 2022. What actually happened is that, of course, as we all know, the United States was warning the Ukrainians and warning the European allies and partners that Russia was mobilizing forces near Ukraine's borders. So many countries in Europe, Finland included, started to prepare for the possibility of an invasion already before it happened in February. And so we had intergovernmental meetings already in December, thinking about possible sanctions on Russia and how would we change our military posture and whatnot. But then the big change was happened almost overnight in public sentiment in Finland, because we were a very pragmatic and security-oriented country. And Finns felt that the way we had approached our security and strategic position in Europe no longer would work to secure Finland's the democracy and freedom and sovereignty and future. So they shifted their position from overwhelmingly being against NATO membership to overwhelmingly supporting NATO membership. And that was the big change that happened in Finland, and the elites largely then followed that shift in public opinion.
What was that process like? Because it was an extremely fast process, thinking about kind of when other countries in Eastern Europe were going through that process in the late 90s, in the 2000s, in the early 2000s. Finland joined extremely quick. How did that come about? Was it just because Finland was so already integrated within NATO standards?
So I would split up the process into a couple of different parts. First, the pre-application period when in the politicians and the government in Helsinki were thinking about whether to apply for membership and whether it would be acceptable to some major players in Europe and including, of course, the United States as the most critical player within NATO. And so there was a bit of uncertainty whether the timing would be right. The United States was, of course, occupied with supporting Ukraine and making sure that NATO's deterrence and collective defense would hold against Russia in a very changed security environment. And then there were also some possible spoilers within NATO and the European Union, such as Hungary, which proved to be an issue during the process. But also there were a couple of question marks about Turkey already before we decided to apply. So that was one thing, making sure that the door was open to NATO, that the process could take place and it would be welcomed by NATO allies. Then once we had some certainty that would be the case and we were welcome to apply, making sure that we would work together in coordination with Sweden, so we wouldn't leave them behind, and they would have their own internal processes ready and their own citizens supporting their historic NATO accession bid as well. Because in many ways, I think the choice was more difficult for the Swedes than for Finns, because as I mentioned, we are a very security-oriented and pragmatic country at the end of the day. After that, when we applied for membership, the first part of the process, ratifications went quite fast, quite quickly. There were some hiccups in the Madrid summit, NATO's Madrid summit, where the Secretary General of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg, who also just wrote his memoirs, had to mediate between Turkey and Finland and Sweden. And Turkey especially had issues with Sweden, but also halted our membership process, partly because Finland didn't want to also be divided from Sweden and leave Sweden alone. But those were solved in the Madrid summit, and we were able to proceed. But then the rest of the process actually got stuck after that for a long time because of these bilateral and trilateral talks between Finland, Sweden, and Turkey. And of course, as you mentioned, the process at the end of the day was very fast, but it felt like an eternity for us. It's just as one example. When we were making our first decisions on how to militarily support Ukraine after the war broke out and Russia invaded Ukraine, we were in a very different spot than many other European countries because we were outside of NATO. So it was one thing for countries bordering Russia who are NATO members to make decisions to send military material to Ukraine, and then for us to make the same decisions. And we made them very fast. So we had greater risks during the NATO accession process than many other European states had for their own security.
And those risks were felt acutely by Finnish society. To hear more about what that major societal shift felt like, I spoke with Mina Olander, an associate fellow at Chatham House and a non-resident fellow at the Center for European Policy Analysis.
The first months of the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine were really intense in Finland. So there was this real concern, and people were actually sort of mentally and to an extent also sort of physically preparing for the possibility that the war might expand beyond Ukraine. And when you look at the map, you can see that there's a lot of sort of room to expand over to Finland with the very long border that we have with Russia. So the mood was like really intense. Just as a personal anecdote, I had this conversation with all my Finnish friends, regardless of their profession and background, about what each and every one of us would do in that case. Also, Finnish friends living abroad, like myself at that time in Germany, we all were wondering whether we should go back. Like, do we need to be able to like do something and so on? Like, what are we supposed to do? So that's just to give some background to like just how intense the mood was, and that also reflected on the NATO process. So in the Finnish case, it was so interesting that it was a completely sort of public opinion driven, in a way, really bottom up process. So the change of opinion happened virtually overnight. Finland had had pretty stable numbers in favor of staying outside of NATO for decades. So support for NATO membership, I don't think that it ever really got even close to 30% of the respondents in any polls before February 2022. But then in the first poll published on the 28th of February, so just a couple days after the full-scale invasion was inled by Russia, we had for the first time a majority. So that was a super clear red line for a lot of Finns. And I think this is something that we often miss when we talk about Russia's war of aggression, that we don't talk enough about our own red lines. So Finland had actually, as you also mentioned, it's really important to remember that Finland had had this long-term policy of building as close a partnership as is possible while still not being a full member of NATO. And it was also linked to this Finnish policy of the so-called NATO option. And this was always sort of a response to Russia's frequent and regular threats towards Finland about what Russia would do if Finland were to join NATO. And Finland would respond sort of, or this NATO option sort of implied towards Russia that, on the other hand, if Russia goes too far, we will do that. So there was this kind of reverse or that kind of response to those Russian threats in it that implicated that if the security environment significantly changes, then Finland will reconsider this choice until then to stay outside of the alliance. And all the conditions were met. The security environment changed radically. It was exactly the kind of push that had always been foreseen as a possible catalyst for the Finnish NATO application. So it was actually very logical in that sense. The interesting thing was that political parties had started moving a little bit in that direction, but then like the urgency of the moment really forced the political leadership actually to catch up with the public opinion, because there was this sense in March 2022 that like, why didn't we join NATO last week? Like, why is it taking so long? Although it only took less than 3 months for Finland to do this complete U-turn. So actually it was extremely fast and agile, but people had no patience whatsoever in that moment.
That's really interesting. You mentioned that, the first thing that happened when you spoke to all of your friends in Finland, like the discussions that, what can everyone do? I think that's so reflective of the culture of Finland. And I guess that leads me to, naturally the next question, which is about Finland's collective defense or whole of government, whole of society defense approach. So you wrote a piece for New Eastern Europe this past summer for their Baltic issue, which I really enjoyed. And you kind of outlined the model and how in Finland's constitution, it's really the civilian responsibility is also part of the defense concept, not just the military, but the whole of the population. So it really, these days, it feels like, the word resilience, collective security, collective defense, whole of security, all kind of buzzwords are popular in discourse about European security these days. And I think, the integration of the civilian component with a military defense strategy is definitely of huge importance to NATO in this day and age. So perhaps can you just walk us through broad strokes? What is Finland's whole of society approach? And perhaps how can other NATO allies learn from it?
So Finland has for a very long time had this sort of comprehensive security approach, or we call it comprehensive security. The Swedes call it total defense, and because Swedes are better at marketing, everybody knows total defense. So let's just call it total defense in Finland too. It's basically the same thing. We used to sort of look to Sweden in the Cold War, like back in the 60s, and like sort of copy some elements. So there's a lot of similarities between the Finnish and Swedish models. It's just that Sweden sort of completely dismantled their system after the Cold War, whereas Finland didn't. So we're right now in a little bit better position compared to Sweden in that sense that we don't have as much catching up to do right now. But basically, the Finnish comprehensive security or total defense system includes exactly the elements that you were mentioning. So there's not only the whole of government approach, which means that all of the sort of branches of government and all kinds of authorities work together. And there's a very sort of quite clear and well exercised division of labor as well, like whose responsibility is what in a different type of crisis. But it also involves this whole of society approach, because basically the reason for this is threefold. So it has to do with Finland's geography, obviously, the fact that we have such a long border with Russia, and that then the second aspect is the history, namely that Russia has basically throughout Finland's history been the only real threat to Finland's security. And then the third aspect is that we have quite a big country actually, sort of in terms of territory, but a small population, only 5.5 million. So in that context, if you want to actually credibly and efficiently defend all of your territory, everything counts. So you need everybody to contribute to the national defense effort. And that's why we have also this constitutional sort of clause, which implies that all citizens are expected to contribute in some way. And for men, it means the military service. So we have this old school conscription system in place still, where it's voluntary for women but obligatory for men. And then for the rest who don't have some kind of a military role, there's a number of national defense related organizations, associations, and all kinds of things. Not only more than 300 reservist organizations, but also this kind of voluntary national defense associations that offer different possibilities for also just civilians to engage and learn skills. And it made global news actually in 2022 that Finnish women signed up for these voluntary courses in record numbers, and there weren't even enough sort of places for everybody in these courses because everybody wanted to learn how to shoot. So that was one part of it. Yeah, so there is this idea that, and it has very intimately to do with what we are seeing in Ukraine. So how Russia wages war is that it very heavily targets civilian infrastructure, like energy infrastructure, like whatever can be in the widest possible sense considered like communications infrastructure, whatever, and it tries to sort of terrorize civilians so as to sort of reduce the morale and so on. And therefore, there's this heavy emphasis on making sure sort of you have the military defense and the civil defense component. And those work together to make sure that even under wartime conditions, civilian life and generally just life in society can keep going, and that generally the state can keep functioning. So that's kind of the idea behind it. And of course, this is very deeply rooted actually in the Finnish expectation that we would be maybe left alone again. So that happened once in the Winter War during the Second World War, that Finland was basically left to face a Soviet invasion alone. So there has always been this really deeply ingrained idea that we have to be able to first and foremost always defend ourselves. We cannot rely on outside help, and that can never be sort of the plan A. It's ideal if we can get some help, which should be the case now that we're in NATO. But nevertheless, that's a very core part of the Finnish defense thinking, that the first and foremost responsibility always lies on our own shoulders.
Part of that security calculus has always been in the far north, in Finland's Arctic regions. I spoke with Joel about how Finland's membership will change how NATO thinks and defends its interests against Russia in this increasingly important region. Well, I want to turn our conversation a bit north. I think it was actually President Stubb who said, maybe during his campaign, that Finland's feet are in the Baltic, but Finland's head is in the Arctic. So, of course, Finland joining NATO has greatly increased NATO's capacity in this increasingly important region. So perhaps can you tell us a little bit more about what Finland's membership means for NATO vis-a-vis the Arctic, and perhaps maybe touch on, I know the Finnish Foreign Ministry recently released a new Arctic strategy. So what has been the reaction to that?
Yeah, well, Finland is basically an island. We're not physically an island, but we might as well be. We're the northern corner of Europe and very dependent on sea lanes in the Baltic Sea for imports and exports. Over 96% goes through the Baltic Sea. So that's the feet part of Finland standing firmly in the Baltic Sea region. And then, as you mentioned, our head, the northern parts of Finland, Lapland or Arctic region, that's the head part. And that's located right next to Murmansk, which is where the Russian strategic nuclear weapons are located. It's where the Russian Arctic fleet is located, and some of their air forces as well, where they have been basically bombing Ukraine from as well from a distance. So it's a very crucial location for Russia militarily, but also economically, because it's the only open seaport location on the European side of Russia that is not surrounded by NATO states and constrained by NATO states. So they have large interests in the European Arctic, commercially, economically, but also crucially militarily. Now, where the Finnish thinking has been maybe developing is that we have historically focused on defensive terms on our southeastern border, which is right next to St. Petersburg, but which is important for the Russians, but it's also the southern part of Finland is where most of the Finnish population and major cities and towns are located. So it makes sense to kind of focus your defense capabilities and resources in the south. But increasingly, we're now building a NATO allied presence in the Finnish Lapland, in the Arctic, that will be led by Sweden, our neighbor, who of course have a joint interest in trying to balance Russian power in the north, but also joined by Norway and some other European states. Even Italy has promised to somehow be present there, which is nice to have our Italian friends from the south practicing winter warfare in Finnish Lapland and whatnot.
Yeah.
But exactly.
I'm sure you guys have special gear for them to provide them with.
Exactly. Yeah. But maybe I'll just end by noting that when you think about the Arctic and NATO, the crucial development is that NATO hasn't historically had an Arctic strategy. And Russia has been able to build a preponderance of power in the Arctic, military power in the Arctic, and that is a direct threat to NATO's security of supply lines in the North Atlantic in a crisis or a conflict between Russia and NATO or some NATO countries. And now this is changing, and NATO is actively discussing whether to have an Arctic strategy. That would be nice, and how to respond to that situation. And countries like Norway historically has been the northernmost NATO member, if you discount Greenland as part of the Kingdom of Denmark, and of course Iceland. And they have had this policy of deterrence and reassurance towards the Soviet Union during the Cold War. So you try to deter, you make sure that the Russians know you will push back if necessary, but you also try not to provoke the Russians and keep the Arctic region out of the high great power tensions and escalations. But that no longer works. And now that Finland and Sweden are also in NATO, Norway is also no longer able to alone decide how NATO presence in the Arctic region, at least the European Arctic part of it, will look like. So there will be more cooperation also between the Nordic countries and what type of NATO presence do we want to have in this part of the Arctic.
Definitely. And I guess, you kind of laid out beautifully all of the Arctic strategy and thinking and what Finland brings to the table. I guess generally in your view, beyond the Arctic, what do you think are Finland's capacity or competency that it's bringing into the alliance that its allies can kind of utilize or learn from?
I'll begin by noting that Finland has prepared historically to defend itself on its own against a great power, Russia, if needed. So we have a wide variety of capabilities in basically all military domains, from land forces to air forces and even our navy in the Baltic Sea. But we are still a very land domain heavy country. So we have a conscription system. We have a reserve of about 900,000 soldiers for wartime if needed. And that's quite a lot for a country of 5.6 million, I would just note.
Indeed. Yeah.
Exactly. And we're currently actually increasing the reserve to 1 million persons. So we're even making more investments as well. And we have the largest artillery in Europe, or at least one of the largest artilleries in Europe. On the Air Forces side, actually the US-Finnish Defense Corporation in the 90s, after the end of the Cold War, kind of started or kicked off with material corporation. So Finland was buying fighter jets from the United States, and that kind of started the Defense Corporation, our new phase in the Defense Corporation, and slowly led us to the path to become a NATO partner and now a NATO member. And now we're buying F-35 jets, 64 F-35 jets from the US, and the first one was actually just released off the factory production line in the States, and our president was also there to greet that. So we have quite modern capabilities. And then on the the societal side of things, we're quite a resilient country. We have this model of comprehensive security where we try to make sure that companies and citizens know how to act and what to do in a crisis or a conflict, what their role will be and what their responsibilities will be. Because as a small country, you need to focus your resources to the defense forces, and that means that civilians will have more responsibilities for their own security and day-to-day resilience. And finally, on the economic and technology side of things, as you might know, we just recently made a deal with the United States on building, I think it was 7 icebreakers, or was it maybe even more, partially in Finland and partially in the United States. So that's technology know-how that we're kind of bringing to the table. Nokia is no longer making cell phones, but they're one of the largest 5G and 6G network providers in the world, and they're very closely working with US companies and the US government. And that's, of course, quite crucial for security these days, making sure that you have efficient and secure networks for all your military hardware as well. And then we have other high-tech know-how, such as quantum computing company. ISA is one of the largest satellite companies on the defense sector these days, and it's a Finnish-Polish startup as well.
So Joel walked us through some of the economic, security, and technology capabilities Finland brings to the table. Another area where the Finns have a great deal of experience is deterring Russian hybrid warfare, an increasingly common occurrence on the Baltic Sea. I spoke with Minna about her recent report on a hybrid warfare tactic that flies a bit under the radar. You contributed to a report for the Stockholm Free World Forum, I believe, on tracking Russian hybrid warfare. And I thought your section was an area of hybrid warfare that maybe doesn't get much attention because we hear about, of course, undersea cables, we hear about drone incursions, but we don't hear about strategic purchases of real estate. So perhaps maybe could you just tell us a little bit about that? Because I thought that was such an interesting, something that's not very covered, I don't think.
Yeah, I think I think that was such an interesting case to present to people outside of Finland, because it's, as you say, not well known, and it shows how long term this whole issue is. Like, it's not that Russia just started doing this as a response to our support to Ukraine, but that this has been ongoing for like way longer time. So what happened in Finland was that in the early 2000s, after the EU accession and so on, Finland sort of relaxed a little bit the laws on like third country nationals, meaning nationals of countries outside of the EU and the European Economic Area, and their rights to buy property in Finland. And then what we saw was a pattern of Russian nationals starting to buy properties, very often sort of allegedly for some holiday or business or holiday business purposes, in interesting locations, like very close to military bases or other strategic areas, or sometimes like, just next to a data center or like a cell tower that is relevant for a lot of communications and conveniently close, so that you may be able to like listen a little bit what's going on. Or like, I don't know, just interesting design options like building high towers in like allegedly holiday homes with a nice view over some kind of an airfield or whatever. So there was definitely a weird sort of feel to this. And by the way, this is not only in Finland. So there's a number of cases also in Sweden and Norway. Like, for example, in Norway, there's some holiday cottages that are on a hill that overlooks a military airfield in northern Norway, known as the Russian cottages, because they are owned by oligarchs close to the Kremlin. And then the Russian Orthodox Church is also in on this. So it's a very dual-use church. There's a couple of churches that have very interesting locations. For example, one is right next to the most important and biggest naval base in Norway. And the other one, in the other interesting cases in Sweden, this one next to an airport, like only 5 minutes walk from an airport, that is quite important also for national defense purposes. So there's a lot of these interesting choices of locations for either churches or holiday villages that Russians have chosen. So in Finland, this pattern started emerging, and the interesting thing was that it was observed, and it was even debated in the Finnish parliament already around 2014, because then there was this concern that Russia was maybe planning to use these properties as some kind of a launch pad in a way for a Little Green Men operation. There were particular concerns about one company that had bought a lot of island and coastal properties in the Finnish archipelago. And that started really looking like they could really establish some kind of an operation from those properties, especially because there were also suspicious elements built there, like a helicopter landing platform on one of the islands and so on. So now what has happened in Finland is that the laws were sort of changed again, so that for the past couple of years now, third country nationals have had to apply for a permit from the Ministry of Defense if they wanted to buy properties in Finland. Quite a number of permits have been also denied. And now this year, the government actually even still sort of like went further and effectively banned Russians entirely from buying properties in Finland. And how they did this was that they wrote a law where a country that is waging a war of aggression and constitutes a security threat to Finland, so nationals from such a country cannot buy property. So that means then like both Russia and Belarusians basically. So now times are very different, and the government is now currently actually also looking into ex post confiscation of properties if they are deemed to potentially constitute a security threat. Yeah, there's quite this is actually a real issue in Finland, which is taking a lot of sort of government attention even. So it's Finland is sort of a front runner here in the other countries where there are known cases where this kind of suspicious purchases have happened, like haven't so far tackled it in any way. So it is pretty interesting that Finland has gone very far also in terms of the legal measures here.
Of course, European NATO members have experienced a variety of hybrid attacks in the past few years, such as civilian drones at airports, infrastructure attacks, warehouse fires, and undersea cable cutting. It is a tense time on both sides of the Atlantic, and I spoke with Joel about the Finnish take on where things stand with transatlantic relations. The recent chapter in our turbulent transatlantic relations was the recently released national security strategy that the Trump administration released just last week, which, of course, the section on Europe, there is a statement that says that Europe should end the perception and prevent the reality of NATO as a perpetually expanding alliance. Now, coming from one of NATO's newest members, I guess what has been the Finnish response to this, and perhaps your personal reaction to this kind of, shift in policy?
Well, I'll start with the Finnish reaction, which is that many Finns feel that since Ukraine supported our NATO membership at a time when they were fighting a war with Russia and there was great uncertainty about their future possible membership in NATO, Finns feel a depth of gratitude towards the Ukrainians and, of course, have been very strong supporters of Ukraine and their fight against Russia since the start of this war. So that's a very clear position that Helsinki has and politicians here have, that the door should be kept open. And if Ukraine wants to join, that's a decision that they need to make. But, of course, NATO needs to be unanimous about actually accepting members. But maybe you don't want to close the door prior to having those discussions in the North Atlantic Council. But then my personal opinion or perspective would be that this is nothing new or surprising. We have known for a long time that Trump is against Ukraine's NATO membership. Actually, the Biden administration was very skeptical of that as well. So this is not maybe a bilateral or it's not a non-partisan position in the United States, but it's certainly something. The concern is maybe shared amongst the both parties in the U.S. But, the framing would be very different between the parties. But what I'm worried about is that we're giving leeway to Russian rhetoric about NATO expanding and NATO being the root cause of this war in Ukraine, which is not true, since even though Ukraine was promised a path towards NATO membership in the Bucharest summit back in the day, there wasn't anything happening concretely before Russia annexed Crimea and before it decided to launch its full-scale invasion. So it's just a precursor, just something that they like to say and blame on NATO and NATO's expansion, even though in concrete terms that there wasn't anything happening. And we shouldn't take that as face value, but challenge that rhetoric and shift the blame to where it actually should be, which is on Russia for invading their neighbor.
Of course, how Russia's war in Ukraine ends has obviously not only direct security implications for Europe as a whole, but certainly for Finland, given its geographic reality. I guess, given all of the recent kind of the flurry of peace deal negotiations, I know the Finnish president has been somewhat involved in drafts or meetings on this. And especially when it comes to Ukraine seeking security guarantees from its NATO and European allies. What has been the Finnish reaction to all of this latest development?
The Finnish president, Alexander Stubb, recently noted domestically, the Finnish media, that Finns need to understand that there is no certainty that there will be a just peace or a just end to the war in Ukraine. And that's a major shift both for the Finnish government but especially maybe personally to President Stubb, because he's usually a very optimistic advocate of the Ukrainian cause and the transatlantic relationship. So that maybe is an indicator that there might be more happening under the surface of the ceasefire talks than we maybe realize while just looking at the surface news stories about different papers flying from Moscow to Kiev to Miami or whatnot. So I'm quite concerned about the ceasefire talks and the peace talks, because I see a major risk of either the United States or more correctly, the Trump administration seeking to force Ukraine to accept a peace deal that would be unbeneficial and unnecessary for them to accept, and would probably subject them to or make them vulnerable to future Russian aggression, but also free up Russian resources to focus on other parts of Europe and NATO as well for possible future provocations. Or another scenario, which is not impossible either, which is that Trump gets frustrated and just walks away from the peace process, and whether he then would cut the Europeans off from supplying Ukraine with American bought weapons and ammunition and US intelligence. I think that would be the most dire scenario that might happen. But I don't see much positive potential in the talks at the moment, sadly.
There are many natural historical parallels between the Finnish and Ukrainian struggle against Russian aggression. I spoke with Minna about where these historical experiences converge and diverge in the context of Russia's war in Ukraine. So recently, the Finnish president said in an interview, I think with the Economist, I believe that Ukraine kind of can learn from this example, or that arguably that Ukraine is in a better position than Finland was in 1944 because it has allies, it does have support from the outside, whereas Finland 1944 had no one to turn to. From your view, do you think there are parallels for Ukraine from the Finnish experience in navigating a place in the world between Russia and the West?
I would say that Finland's example is more a cautionary tale to Ukraine and other countries in also in the South Caucasus. I would say that what we are seeing right now in Georgia, for example, is essentially like a Finlandization attempt gone wrong. And I'm happy to elaborate because, first of all, I would say that what Ukraine is experiencing now feels to us like their winter war, but just much longer, unfortunately. But what happened after the winter war, and this is quite important, was that Finns were really shocked about the conditions of the interim peace. And when Finland, in the first instance, had to cede territory in Karelia to the Soviet Union, because it was partially due to the pretty optimistic war propaganda, and that came as a shock to the population. And that then, of course, sort of, led to this kind of revanchist spirit, which also was part of, I mean, obviously, Finland was at that point in time between the rock and the hard place with no outside support, and both sort of Nazi Germany encroaching on Finland, and then the very likely possibility that the Soviet Union would invade again. So that was definitely part of the reason, but it also led to the continuation war to an extent, because like Finland did try to take back those territories in the continuation war. And unfortunately, as it happened, we ended up losing more. I think the sort of like what I really wish that the Ukrainians are spared is this kind of painful concessions and conditions of a peace that then like just is untenable and unacceptable to the population and will lead to this kind of revanchism. And then also during the Cold War, so why I always personally and many Finns feel the same, like get very triggered about these suggestions that Finlandization could be an option for Ukraine. It definitely wouldn't be, and there's like a number of reasons for this, but the most important reason was that for Finland being less important was both a blessing and a curse. So it was a curse in the sense, of course, as you said, that we didn't get much more than like, sympathy from the outside. But on the other hand, we were also much less important for the Soviet Union than Ukraine is to Putin today. So Finland was never anywhere close to the priority spot that Ukraine has on Putin's obsession scale. So this kind of arrangement will never ever be an option for Russia. So even if Ukraine wanted to like try this, I don't think that it would ever be enough or acceptable to Russia. And then there's also like just with when I'm thinking about, for example, the Georgian example, there is this inherent danger. So in Finland, this kind of balancing act where you had to very carefully and cautiously take into consideration Soviet interest in the foreign policy, and there were numerous limitations on Finland's room for maneuver that Finland was then like sort of trying to navigate by emphasizing that it was a neutral country, like a neutral independent country, not a part of the Soviet Union, and therefore was able to sort of balance it like to an extent with having relations and trade and so on, also with the West at the same time, as long as it was balanced, But the issue was in the Finnish case, there were two big differences to, for example, Ukraine today. And one was that Finland had at that point already consolidated as a democracy. So Finland had a pretty resilient domestic democratic system. And the Russian influence in Finland was on a much lower level because the contacts had also been sort of less between Finland and Russia. Even when Finland was a part of the Russian Empire, Finland had really wide autonomy. And Finland never really became so much a part of the Russian world in that sense.
Yeah.
An ex-ambassador of Finland to Russia and Sweden once described this as Finland having been part of the Sweatskimir, like the Swedish world, not the Russian world, and that the Russians knew it sort of. So I would say that was one important reason why it was possible to balance it. Like it had negative effects on Finland, both domestically and internationally, of course, but it didn't, like we managed to sort of like not let it go too far. And I think we see in the Georgian case how that's like very hard to like maintain that balance if you already have a substantial like Russian influence within the country and then sort of like weak democratic institutions. So it's much harder there. And then also in the Finnish case, Finland had this Nordic group as a framework group to sort of rely on. And there was quite a lot of support from, for example, Sweden and also Norway. And generally, this just like placed Finland differently in the international context. And it sort of also was a marker against the Soviet Union that Finland belonged to the Nordic group, which clearly was not part of the Russian sphere or the Soviet sphere of influence. I mean, Ukraine simply lacks all of these sort of things or these features that Finland had at that point in time. And also, what is quite often misunderstood about Finlandization is that in Finland, Finlandization describes an era in history. It's not actually a strategy. It was just that period of time. Right. And that also sort of indicates why it can't be replicated. And of course, like one would hope that the past 80 years mean something and everything that has happened in that time in terms of figuring out rules for like relations between states, that like borders can't be changed by force and so on. So that's like, of course, the main reason, like that has nothing to do even with Ukraine or Finland or any other countries. That should be reason enough why this shouldn't be an option anymore these days.
So turning to our last question here, which is also my favorite question, which I've been asking all of our guests on this season, and that is, what would you like Americans to know about Finland's contributions to NATO and why it is so important to support alliances like NATO going forward?
Well, maybe I would say a couple of things. Firstly, that regardless of all the noise that is happening in international politics and on international media and uncertainty over the direction of the Trump administration, Finns deeply appreciate the American contribution to European security and to NATO, and we like Americans here, and I don't think that's going to change, even though there will be, of course, question marks about Trump's commitment to European security. And secondly, from the American perspective, I've often thought that it makes sense for American policymakers and the US government to want to shift their attention and resources to the Indo-Pacific and to China. But historically speaking, US completely cutting itself off from Europe or trying to ignore Europe hasn't ended very well, because it has always ended up pulling America back in at a worse moment and at a higher cost for the United States' own security, because the balance of power in Europe has been so dependent on the US contribution. And I don't think that has actually changed. So I will just conclude by saying that what I would like to happen is for us in Europe to take more responsibility for our own security and our own defense so that the United States can focus on the priorities that the US has, but without abandoning Europe at a cost that would be higher for America in the future.
Finland has a pretty unique system in the sense that there is this remarkable consistency in keeping up the system, like in the threat analysis, and then also taking the right measures. So in Finland, there is this realization that as a small nation like us, we need to at any time be able to demonstrate real national defense capability. So that's why Finland has kept up this conscription system, for example, which means that Finland, although it's a small population, only 5.5 million, it nevertheless has a sort of total reserve of almost 900,000 at the moment. And the interesting thing is that the government is looking into increasing the age limit of the reserve to 65, which would then bring some 125,000 more guys into the reserve, like older ones, of course, but there's a lot that they can also do, like, logistics or like, I don't know, whoever can operate a drone, who has the technical know-how. So, so this would like make Finland sort of crack the 1 million in terms of like mobilizable forces. So this fourth generation ability is something that is really rare in the European context, because most European countries adopted this expeditionary warfare model with the professional force. And I think this is really interesting, sort of, especially from an American point of view, because this is the model that really works for small countries that could never keep up these numbers in terms of professional armies, because it would be simply way too expensive. And then all of these people will be missing from the workforce. And at the same time, you have this like highly specialized skills that the people bring in from their civilian life into the reserve. So that's also like a huge strength. And then, of course, Finland has kept investing in the capability as well. We like to joke in Finland that for us, the peace dividend meant really good prices on the secondhand market, actually, because like other European countries decided that they don't need a land force anymore. So Finland bought tanks from Germany and the Netherlands and other systems for really good prices 20 years ago. And now you can only dream of like getting something like that when everybody.
Yeah, but they're regretting that now.
Yeah, exactly. So it was good for us, less good for them. So that's maybe one thing. And then, I mean, obviously, so there were two lessons from the Winter War, and this has to do with your second question. So the first one was this, that like we always have to be able to defend ourselves, because you never know whether help will reach us. Even if somebody wanted to, they may not get to us or something. The second one was, on the other hand, something that a general from the war said, that we should never again be alone. Like we should never again, like if we at all can avoid it, we should try to avoid like having to fight Russia alone. It was so emotional when Finland became member of NATO, precisely for this reason. This was something that people repeated all the time: never again alone. Like now we're finally part of something bigger. Now we can actually like sort of rely on people helping us. And we also sort of joked about that now we finally also got Sweden to like sign a treaty that will obligate them to help us, because in the Winter War, it was only volunteers who came from Sweden to help, but Sweden like officially stayed neutral. So that is, and the power of NATO is, of course, that there's two things. Like, first of all, it has stopped its members from waging war against each other, which is one thing in Europe, you know. It's quite a success in that sense. Like we need to sort of like take the wins that we get. And then the second thing is, of course, that the NATO members have not been attacked so far. And we would really like to keep it that way. I mean, the fact that countries still want to join and like even line up to join NATO is really proof of the power of this kind of values-based, actually not only interest, but also values-based cooperation across the Atlantic, and how much it means to Europe. The US has been an absolutely sort of essential part of European security for 80 years. For example, for small countries like not only Finland, but the other Nordic countries as well. We had some attempts before and during the Second World War, and even after, to establish like a Scandinavian or a Nordic defense union. But then it sort of became clear that kind of a small state union would sort of lack credibility. So small states, and like almost all European countries are small states, need the backing of a great power to sort of have this credible deterrent against a bully neighbor like Russia. So It's especially this sort of extended deterrent that the US has provided Europe that is incredibly important, because like we can take care of the conventional side of things, but if we want to actually avoid like having to fight a war, there's like the US contribution is so important. I would say that it's been a really good deal for the US as well to have this kind of whole community of allies who are willing to, although of course like between democracy there's always been like some kinds of dispute about everything, but nevertheless in the big picture, like the US has been able to rely on the European allies as well. So for example, in the past 30 years it hasn't really been necessary to defend Europe from Russia. It has more been about Europeans supporting the US in the war against terrorism and other things. So this has actually been a really valuable arrangement for both sides of the Atlantic. There is really like power in this, and it has been especially the American soft power that has played an absolutely massive role in all this.
A special thanks again to Joel and Minna for taking the time to share insights about Finland's role in NATO. And thank you to all of you listeners and subscribers this year for supporting this project. This is our last episode of 2025, but if you enjoyed it, please do check out our previous features on Poland, Romania, and Latvia. And this is also just a snippet of our conversations. The full interviews and transcripts with all of our guests this season and last year's season are available on the Ties That Bind Substack. If you have any suggestions about what NATO members we should feature next year, or have any questions or feedback, please don't hesitate to reach out to us at comms@fpri.org. The Ties That Bind is a project of the Foreign Policy Research Institute, generously supported by the NATO Public Diplomacy Division. For more information about this and other initiatives, please visit us at fpri.org. This episode was produced by Natalia Kapitnik, with a special thanks to Sarah Helena Maravodi and Leah Pedro for production assistance, and Katie Janner for editing. Until next time, I'm Natalia Kapitnik, and you've been listening to The Ties That Bind, NATO Allies in Action.